I have always lived in the midst of luxury and wealth. Since childhood, I had been pampered in ways that many never dreamed of. I grew up in a world where there was no room for rejection, where every whim was fulfilled as if I were the king of my own little empire. All my desires were easily fulfilled, and I was so used to it that I took comfort and luxury for granted. My father, being a successful millionaire, provided me with everything I could wish for. The latest gadgets, fashionable clothes from the leading brands, exotic trips to the best resorts in the world. All this became part of my everyday life, and I did not even think about how difficult it was for my father to achieve this level of success. Our huge house, not even a house but a real palace, was filled with incredibly expensive things. There were art objects everywhere, old paintings, sculptures, rare antiques that cost a fortune. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it. For me, it was all just a background to my daily existence. But amidst all this luxury, there was one thing that stood out to my father, and its value surpassed everything else. It was an old Ford, his first car, which he had bought with his own money at the beginning of his journey to success. It was more than just an automobile to him. His father always talked about how this particular Ford symbolized his formation, his struggle for success, and his first step towards financial independence. He cared for that car like no one had ever cared for any of our high-end expensive cars. Even though we had many luxury cars in our garage, Porsche, Bentley, Ferrari, my father absolutely forbade me from touching his beloved Ford. Every time I tried to express my displeasure or suggest that he get rid of this old wreck, he firmly forbade my attempts. "It's not just a car," he repeated. "It's part of my history, a symbol of all the efforts I've made to get where we are today." I couldn't understand his attachment to this old thing, because we had a fleet of modern luxury cars. But to him, that Ford was sacred. One day, when my parents went to a charity event, I had a brilliant idea to teach my father a lesson. I drank a bottle of whiskey, and alcohol, as it often does, added to my confidence. I felt like I understood everything perfectly and had a clear picture of what to do. I decided it was time to finally show my father that his beloved car was just a piece of old scrap metal, nothing more. I was sure that after that he would stop being so fond of that Ford and maybe even give me the keys to that brand new Lamborghini I had been dreaming of for so long. After all, in my beliefs, it was me, his only son, who deserved the best, not some old Ford. I snuck into the garage, trying to act as quietly as possible. Even though my parents were away at a charity event, I still felt tense, like someone might catch me red-handed. The garage was huge, filled with collector and modern cars, but among all the luxury, it was the old legend, the Ford that my father had cherished and preserved as if it were the most precious thing we had. In the back of my mind, I knew I might be doing the wrong thing, but the alcohol had already fogged my head, and my common sense had receded. I found the keys quickly. They were in the usual place. At that moment, it seemed to me that it was a kind of symbolic act. I was going to prove that this car was just a piece of junk, not worthy of attention. I started the engine, and instead of the usual roar of sports cars, I heard a muffled, rattling roar of the engine, which had obviously survived more than 100,000 kilometers. This sound was so unusual and even unpleasant that instead of stopping and thinking, I felt an even greater desire to prove my superiority. As I pulled onto the road, I began to pick up speed. The Ford resisted like a stubborn old man. The steering was tight, and the gas pedal responded slowly and reluctantly. I tried to accelerate, expecting the same sensations I had experienced behind the wheel of our new sports cars. I wanted to feel the familiar drive, the roar of the engine, the breathtaking speed. But this old car was clearly not designed for such high-speed maneuvers. But I wasn't going to stop. Just a little more, I thought, pressing hard on the gas, forgetting everything but the sensation of speed. But everything went wrong. On one of the tight turns, I jerked the steering wheel too hard. The car skidded, spinning in place. I felt a cold sweat run down my back, and panic swept over me. I frantically tried to steady the car, but the controls slipped completely out of my hands. A moment later, there was a deafening bang, and everything went black before my eyes. The car hit the tree at full speed. I was literally crushed into the seat as the airbags deployed. Despite the pain that shot through my body, I realized that it could have been much worse. The car turned into a pile of mangled metal, and only a miracle saved me from more serious consequences. Gradually, as the shock began to recede, I realized the full extent of the disaster. Fear of what I had just done began to creep into my consciousness. This wasn't just an accident. I had destroyed something sacred to my father, a personal heirloom. And with each passing moment, that realization became more agonizing. Soon my father rushed to the scene of the accident. He seemed barely able to breathe, his face white as chalk when he saw what was left of his beloved car. He didn't look at me right away. At first he looked at the mangled wreckage of the car in silence for a long time, as if he couldn't believe what had happened. Then his gaze, full of a mixture of anger and disappointment, settled on me. I'd never seen him like that before, silent, writhing in pain and emotion. "Do you realize what you've done?" he asked quietly, but there was more than a question in his voice. It was accusation, frustration, and maybe even despair. His voice shook. He could barely contain his emotions that seemed ready to burst out. It wasn't just a car. It was my story. It was a reminder of where I started from. And you destroyed it for a momentary whim. I tried to justify myself, trying to smooth things over by saying that it was just an old car, that we could easily buy a new one, better than the old one, and everything would go back to normal. But every word I said stabbed him in the heart like a dagger. My father listened to me with cold detachment, and I could see his disappointment growing with each passing moment. "It's not about money," he said abruptly, interrupting me. "It's about respect. You're missing the point. Respect for labor, respect for memory, respect for history. Everything I tried to teach you, you trampled on in 1 second. I gave you everything, and you thought you could take even more by destroying what I had spent years building." His words were an icy shower for me. In that moment, I realized I had made an irreparable mistake. The shock and fear of the possible repercussions were unrelenting. My father didn't speak to me for days, and there was a silence between us that was heavier than any words. Mother, as usual, tried to smooth things over. She said that things would get better with time, that my father would calm down and realize that I had made a mistake because of my youth and stupidity. But I could see the disappointment in her eyes, too, as if a part of her had stopped trusting me. We were no longer the close-knit family where my mistakes were forgiven immediately after a brief conversation. 3 days passed. All this time, my father remained silent and aloof. He avoided seeing me, and that made the guilt worse. I realized what I had done, but I had no idea how to fix it. I hoped that the situation would calm down over time, as it had before, but I was wrong. On the 3rd day, my father called me into his office. My father's office was always a place I entered with trepidation. It was where important decisions were made about the family's affairs, where our problems were discussed. When I entered, I expected a stern lecture on irresponsibility and the consequences of my actions. I was prepared for his anger, for rebuke, and even for some punishment. But what I heard shocked me. My father was sitting at his massive desk, the symbol of his power and success. He stared at me silently for a while, as if assessing whether I was ready for what he was about to say. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking for a long time about what to do next," he began slowly, restrained. But every word sounded like a sentence. "And I've come to the conclusion that you're not the only one to blame for what happened. It was my own fault for spoiling you, for giving you everything you wanted without teaching you to appreciate what you had. I did it with the best of intentions, but in the end you didn't learn responsibility." He paused and I stood in front of him, feeling cold sweat break out on my forehead. His next words were a real blow to me. "This ends today," he continued. "You're not getting another penny from me. I'm withdrawing your financial support. No more credit cards, no more bank accounts, no more access to family money. You will no longer live off me." I stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. Father continued. "Furthermore, you will leave this house. Immediately. You must start living on your own, learning to cope, learning to understand what it means to earn money with your own hands. I've given you everything, but now you must learn to provide for yourself." These words sounded like a thunderclap. Everything I was used to, the luxury, the comfort, the ease with which my every wish was fulfilled, suddenly disappeared from my life. But my father did not stop there. He spoke on, and his next words came as a shock. "But that's not all," he said, not giving me time to comprehend what I had heard. "In order for you to learn not only responsibility, but also respect for the labor of others, you will get married." I could hardly believe my ears. "Marry?" I asked again, not believing that this was really happening. "Yes, you are," he repeated, "and not to some socialite or model you used to surround yourself with. You're marrying Maria." Maria? I vaguely remembered her. She was a young, modest girl who worked as a cleaner in one of my father's offices. She was from a poor family, quiet and inconspicuous. The complete opposite of the glamorous girls I usually spent time with at parties and expensive resorts. I was so stunned I didn't know what to say. I tried to protest, to convince my father that this was crazy, that he couldn't demand that I marry someone on his orders. But his face was adamant and his words were cold, as if he'd made that decision long ago. "You have a choice," he said, his voice harder. "Either you agree to my terms and learn to live like a normal person, or you forget forever that you have a family and an inheritance." I froze. Those words sounded like an ultimatum, and I realized my father wasn't kidding. He was really ready to leave me with nothing if I didn't accept his terms. I stood before him, torn between pride, resentment, and fear. Everything I thought was immutable in my life was crumbling right in front of me. My father looked at me, waiting for an answer, and I realized I had no choice. I was desperate. My whole life was crumbling before my eyes, like a sand castle being washed away by the tide. It seemed to me that my father had gone mad, that this was some temporary punishment he had devised in anger. I thought that everything was about to go back to normal, and that this strange story would be just an episode to remember with laughter. But as it turned out, I was very wrong. Father was more serious than ever. My pleas and protests had no effect. A week later, a modest wedding ceremony was organized, which went quickly and without unnecessary pomp. No lavish feasts, no loud toasts from influential guests. All that was a thing of the past. Only Maria's closest relatives attended the wedding, and my friends, with whom I shared all the pleasures of life, of course, were not invited. Even my mother didn't come. She only called me after the ceremony and told me that she supported my father's decision. After the wedding, I moved into Maria's small, modest home, which was on the outskirts of town. It was not what I was used to, not a huge mansion overlooking the ocean, but a tiny house with one floor and a small garden. There, in this simple house, I got to know a different side of life, the daily struggle for survival, the worries and problems that had seemed distant and alien to me before. As it turned out, Maria had a sick mother who needed constant care. Everything Maria earned from her job went to medication and medical bills. The first weeks were a real nightmare for me. I was completely unable to do basic things. Not cooking, not cleaning, not even washing my own clothes. I had always thought that such small things should be done by servants, but now I was in a situation where I had no choice. Maria patiently taught me everything I needed to know. She showed me how to cook a simple meal, how to do laundry by hand, how to keep the house clean. But despite her patience, I felt like a complete idiot. Any little thing I hadn't paid much attention to before became a challenge for me. I spilled water when I washed the dishes, constantly oversalted my food, or forgot to turn on the washing machine. My pride crumbled with each new failure. An even bigger challenge was finding a job. With no experience and no real skills that could be useful in the real world, I could only qualify for the lowest paying positions. After long and humiliating attempts, I finally got a job as a waiter in a small cafe on the corner of the street. Every day was a real torture for me. I would come home exhausted, with aching feet from standing on my feet all the time and a headache from the constant hustle and bustle of the cafe. I was used to other living conditions, to comfort and luxury, and now that it was all gone, I found myself alone with the harsh reality. Every dollar I earned was hard to come by, and I began to realize the cost of money when it doesn't come to you easily, by birthright. Nevertheless, Maria always found the strength to take care of the house, even after her hard work. Despite her fatigue, she cooked dinner every night, cleaned the house, and took care of her mother. At first, I didn't understand how she managed to remain so calm and patient under conditions that seemed unbearable to me. Gradually, I began to change. I began to respect not only Maria's labor, but also my own. Every dollar I earned now mattered to me. I realized that happiness does not depend on the amount of money or luxurious things, but on how you live your life and with whom you spend it. Maria turned out to be an amazing girl, smart, kind, with a subtle sense of humor and a huge heart. I began to understand why my father had chosen her for me. At first I thought it was another punishment, but over time I realized that it was his way of helping me to become a better person, to grow as a person. Maria not only taught me a lot, but also helped me see the real value of life. The money I was earning from my job as a waiter seemed ridiculous to me before. Such sums flew away in one night at the club, but now they were the result of hard work. My past entourage, having found out where I was working now, started coming to the cafe with the express purpose of making fun of me. They ordered the cheapest dishes on the menu, ostentatiously loudly discussed how low I had fallen, and left me a meager tip, deliberately belittling my dignity. Every such visit was like a personal humiliation for me. I saw the contempt in their eyes and felt all my former confidence melt away with every word they said. But I couldn't change anything. Life made me stand in front of them, take their orders, and smile, even if inside I was filled with shame and anger. When I returned home, I was greeted by Maria's sick mother, her weak, emaciated body, and an exhausted face that gave away the daily struggle with illness. At first it was hard for me to look at, and I tried to shut myself off from these problems. The money I earned went solely for my personal needs. I still hoped to retain at least a bit of my old life, at least in the little things. Expensive cigarettes, brand-name coffee, clothes I was used to. It gave me a false sense of comfort, as if I hadn't completely fallen out of my old world. But after 2 months, something inside me began to change. I began to realize how disproportionate my spending was compared to the real needs of our family. I could no longer just live as if I wasn't responsible for anything. I started buying groceries for the house, helping Mary with household chores, and even started giving money for her mother's medicine, realizing that every dollar could save her one more day, extend her life just a little bit. This decision was not easy for me, because for the first time I was faced with the fact that I had to take care not only of myself, but also of others. It was a new and difficult experience for me. However, in spite of our efforts, Mama Maria's condition worsened day by day. The disease progressed so rapidly that even the doctors could offer nothing comforting. Time was passing, and we were woefully short of funds for the necessary treatment. Maria and I worked 12 and sometimes 16 hours a day without a day off, but still the money was not enough. I would come home in the evening, exhausted, and at home I would be greeted by an even more depressing sight: Maria, who looked like she was about to break under the weight of all these problems, and her mother, who could barely get out of bed. Every night I fell asleep with a feeling of powerlessness and guilt that I couldn't change anything. I began to blame myself for not being able to help them the way they deserved. One day, when the situation reached a critical point, I decided to take a step that previously seemed impossible. I gathered all my pride into a fist and went to my father. It was the first time in a long time that I decided to come to my parents' house, not at his invitation. I knew it could be humiliating, but there was no other option. I couldn't just sit there and watch Maria's mom die before our eyes. When I entered my father's office, he was sitting behind his massive desk, as unapproachable as ever. Not long ago, I had considered this office a symbol of power and unwavering success, but now it was a place that filled me with fear and uncertainty. My father looked up at me, and there was no anger or disappointment in his gaze, only cold calm. "To what do I owe this visit?" he asked me dryly, as if I were just a business partner coming to negotiate. I began to talk about what had happened over the past months. I talked about Maria, about her sick mother, about our efforts, about how we fight for every day, for every opportunity to prolong her life. I talked about how we are struggling to cope, but the money is running out and we can no longer afford treatment. I asked my father for help, for him to help save the person who had become not just a part of my new life, but perhaps the only link between me and the person I was meant to be. I asked him to give us money for treatment because I didn't know where else to turn. My father listened in silence. He didn't interrupt, he didn't ask questions, he just sat there looking at me. When I finished, his silence lasted a few more seconds. He looked at me long and intently, as if weighing something, evaluating my behavior, my request. There was no pity in his gaze, but I saw something more in it perhaps, for the first time in a long time. He saw me as someone who was ready to take responsibility. "It's not my problem," he said in an icy tone that cut through my nerves like a knife. "You chose this life, and now you have to take care of your new family." His words hit me like a slap in the face. I'd expected anything: fierce anger, ridicule, or even a note of contempt, but not this cold, almost indifferent detachment. It was as if the man who had once been everything to me had cut me off with one single decision, leaving no chance for reconciliation. "But, Dad," I tried to object, but he interrupted me with a hard, unyielding gesture, not letting me finish. "You're not a child anymore," he said without raising his voice, but his tone was firm. "You created this situation, and you're going to get out of it. It's part of your lesson, and I'm not going to solve your problems for you anymore." I left my father's office empty-handed and devastated. The whole ride back home seemed infinitely long and arduous. My mind was churning inside me, trying to figure out how I could have been so blind before. I had spent so many years thinking only of my own pleasures, of how to satisfy my whims, without noticing the suffering or the needs of others, even those who were close to me. And now, when I was truly in trouble, when another person's life depended on my decision, I realized how helpless and unprepared I was for real life. When I finally returned home, Maria met me with tearful eyes. There was a mixture of horror and despair in her gaze, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. "They're taking my mom to the hospital," she said, sobbing. "We need a large sum of money for treatment, but we don't have it." Her words were the last straw that shattered my illusions. At that moment, I realized that I had to do everything I could to help this family, even if it meant giving up my old life and going to extreme measures. Without a moment's hesitation, I gave away all my savings that I had accumulated over the months of working as a waiter. But it was too little. The amount the hospital demanded was incomparably more. I could not allow Maria and her mother to remain in this situation, so I took the desperate step of looking for a second job. After searching and rejections, I finally managed to get a job as a loader at the local market. The job was extremely physically demanding, but I didn't care. It didn't require education and paid enough to cover my medical expenses. It was my only chance to help Maria and her mother, and I was willing to make any sacrifice. Now my day started at 5 in the morning. I got out of bed, even though my body protested every morning with pain and fatigue. I would go to the market where I would carry heavy crates, bags of groceries and loads until lunchtime. My hands, which had never known any physical labor before, quickly became covered with deep calluses and bleeding abrasions. My back was so sore that I could hardly move, and my legs were buzzing from the constant strain. But after lunch, I had no time to rest. I went straight to the cafe for my main job as a waiter. It was a different, but no less exhausting labor. Always on my feet, always with a smile on my face, always in the hustle and bustle and under pressure from customers. I would return home deep into the night, so exhausted I could barely stay on my feet. The first few weeks were a living hell. Every morning was a feat. Every morning I woke up feeling decades older. When I woke up, I felt such pain in my muscles and joints that it felt like I couldn't get out of bed. But I knew it was necessary. I couldn't allow myself to let my hands drop because another person's life was on the line. That thought kept me afloat, gave me the strength to get up and keep going despite my exhaustion. Maria supported me as much as she could. She always found time and energy to take care of me, despite her own tiredness. In the mornings, when I was going to work, she would get up early to prepare me lunches that I could take with me. These simple home-cooked meals became not only a source of energy for me, but a true symbol of her care and love. At the end of the day, when I literally fell exhausted on the bed, Maria would quietly come to me and begin to massage my tired shoulders and back, trying to relieve the tension. Her gentle touch and kind words soothed me, helped me forget about pain and fatigue, if only for a few moments. Her support was my backbone. I did not know how I would have survived all these difficulties without her. It was thanks to Maria that I found the strength to get up every morning and go to work when it seemed that my strength had left me completely. She didn't complain about our life, even though she worked just as hard as I did. Instead, she gave me her tenderness and faith, helping me not only physically but also emotionally to cope with our ordeal. I saw understanding and sympathy in her eyes, but never once did I see pity, only determination to keep going. Gradually, to my surprise, our financial situation began to slowly improve. We were able to raise enough money to pay for the first course of treatment for Maria's mom. This was a huge accomplishment for us, and although there was still a lot of work to be done, we finally felt that our struggle was paying off. The doctors told us that her mother was making progress, that the therapy was working, but that we needed to continue treatment to consolidate the results. These words gave us hope, and Maria and I began to work even harder, knowing that every dollar we earned could save her mother's life. One evening when I returned from my night shift at the market, completely exhausted, I was greeted by Maria with a smile on her face. She looked unusually happy, and I noticed a light in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "I have a surprise for you," she said with a slight smile, handing me a small envelope. I took it in surprise and opened it. Inside was a modest amount of money, much less than what I was making in a month at my 2 jobs, but it was a fortune to us. I looked at the money and then at Maria, not understanding where it could have come from. "Where did it come from?" I asked, still confused. Maria told me, with slight embarrassment, that she had found a way to work part-time while I was at work. It turned out that she was translating texts online in the evenings when I was busy on my shift. Despite all her tiredness, she didn't want to just sit around and wait for me to bring money home. She decided to contribute to our common cause. "I thought I should help too," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. "You work so hard for us. I can't sit back and watch you wear yourself out. I want to help." I stood in front of her with the envelope in my hands, and in that moment I realized how much I had changed over the months. Before, I would have laughed at such a paltry sum. To me, used to luxury and spending on useless things, it would have seemed pitiful. But now it was different. I looked at this money and realized that it was earned with the same labor as mine, that behind it there was not only work, but also the desire to help, love, and care. And that touched me to the core. Tears danced in my eyes, and I felt great gratitude and pride for my wife. I cautiously approached Maria, put my arms around her, and held her close to me. We stood like that for a long time, in silence, savoring this moment of oneness. Something new was growing inside of me, a feeling that was unfamiliar to me before. It wasn't just love or affection. It was something more, deeper. I realized that in front of me stood a person with whom I was ready to go through any trials. We became a true family where each was willing to sacrifice himself for the other. It was a feeling I had never experienced before, a feeling of real, deep, and sincere love, responsibility and care that bound us firmly to each other. Weeks passed, then months, and our lives went on as usual. Maria and I continued to work tirelessly, saved every penny, and rejoiced at the slightest progress in the treatment of her mother. Her condition gradually improved. The doctors, who at first were skeptical, now began to talk about the real possibility of remission if we could continue therapy. This news gave us hope, but also reminded us that there was still a lot of work ahead. We lived in a constant struggle for each new day, but this struggle taught me to appreciate life, labor, and love more than ever before. One evening, as Mary and I sat in the kitchen discussing our plans for the future, we heard an unexpected knock on the door. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it was one of the neighbors. But when I opened the door, my father was standing in front of us. He looked different than usual. His face was tense and his eyes were troubled, not at all like the confident, calm man I'd known all my life. "May I come in?" he asked quietly, almost tentatively, which alarmed me. Maria and I looked at each other. As always, she showed her kindness by inviting him into the house and inviting him to sit at our modest kitchen table. My father looked around our small apartment, as if assessing all the changes that had taken place in my life over the past few months. His gaze slowly slid over the modest furniture, the stacks of books, and the simple decorations that had been made by our own hands. It was strange to see him in these surroundings, a man who was used to luxury and comfort, who only saw me in the context of wealth and privilege. "Son, we need to talk," he began slowly, as if choosing his words. I waited tensely for him to continue, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. What he said in the next few minutes left me stunned. The words I heard were the words I had dreamed of for so long, but now couldn't believe. "The time for your punishment is over," my father said, barely concealing his nervousness. "You can go back to your normal life. Your accounts are unblocked. Your room in our house is waiting for you. We've been waiting for you all this time." At first I had the feeling that the world around me was beginning to spin. These words, which once would have been a lifesaver for me, now did not evoke the excitement I had expected. All this time I had truly dreamed of one day returning to a life of luxury, of parties, of money and freedom from worry. But now, sitting at the table with Maria, looking at our cozy little apartment, I suddenly realized that I couldn't do it. I couldn't just pick up and leave everything she and I had built over the months. I looked at Maria in silence, and in her eyes I saw the same question that I had seen in my thoughts. What choice will I make? It seemed like an eternity until I found the strength to say the words I didn't expect myself to say. "Dad, I can't," I said, almost in a whisper, but firmly. "I can't leave Maria and her mom. They need me, and I need them. They're my family now." Dad was silent for a long time, not saying a word. I saw his face tense up, and then suddenly something I never expected happened. A single tear slowly rolled down his cheek. It was so unexpected that I was literally speechless. My father, who had always been a symbol of strength, of steadfastness, was showing me his emotions like never before. "Now you are truly a man," he said at last, his voice trembling, punctuated by emotion. "You've passed the test, son." I sat in silence, realizing the weight of his words. And then he told me something that turned my whole view of recent events upside down. It turned out that my father had been secretly supporting us from the beginning. All this time he had been funding Mama Mary's treatment, paying the hospital bills, and providing the best medication so she could get the most expert treatment. I was shocked. He never mentioned it, never showed that he was involved in our lives. I was sure we were struggling alone, but in reality, my father was quietly watching over us, helping in our time of need. His plan wasn't to punish me, but to give me a chance to realize what real life was, responsibility, and what it meant to be a family. "This was your final test," my father continued, his voice softer but still firm. "I wanted to make sure you'd really changed, that you wouldn't give up on your new family, even if you were faced with the possibility of going back to your old life, the carefree, luxurious life you'd led before." I sat across from him, stunned and confused by this confession. My mind was swarming with thoughts. All these months, I had lived in complete confidence that every dollar Maria and I earned was going toward her mom's treatment. I felt proud that we could manage together, that I had finally learned responsibility. But now things were different. Dad had been there all along, but standing in the shadows, helping us even when we didn't realize it. But why? I struggled to say, still not fully understanding. Why did you have to make such a big show of it? Why not tell me right away? My father sighed heavily, leaned back in his chair, and looked me straight in the eye. I could see strength in his gaze, but I could also see fatigue in his gaze. Apparently, this ordeal had been as difficult for him as it had been for me. Because I wanted you to understand the most important thing, he replied. Money does not make a man happy. True happiness is not material goods or luxuries, but the ability to sacrifice yourself for those you love. And you've proven that you've learned that lesson. You didn't just go through hardship, you changed from the inside out. He believed that this was the only way I could truly grow up and understand responsibility, family, and love. His words made me realize how deeply he cared for me. All this time, when I thought I was abandoned and rejected, my father stood in the shadows, watching my every move and supporting me in my most difficult moments without revealing his role. The next day, my life changed completely. Maria and I moved into my parents' house. But this was no longer the spoiled boy who had once wrecked his father's car and was used to an easy life on everything. I became a different person, mature, responsible, and grateful for each new day. Everything I've been through has changed me, and Maria played a key role in that. She taught me true love, simplicity, and that true values are not bought with money. From that day on, I completely gave up alcohol and partying, realizing how much damage they had brought to my life. Instead, I went to university to get an education and learn how to manage the family business. My father began to slowly bring me into his business, teaching me the ins and outs and preparing me to one day step into his shoes and take over the company. It wasn't easy, but now I was ready for it. I realized that I didn't just want to enjoy the legacy, but to contribute to it, to work as my father had done. Maria, for her part, was no longer working as a waitress. She was now involved in philanthropy, helping struggling families just like her own. Her personal experience and compassion proved invaluable in this work. She understood how important it was to not only support others, but to instill in them a belief in a better future. I could see her eyes light up when she talked about those she was able to help. It brought her a joy that lit up our lives. Maria's mom, thankfully, began to get better. The best doctors my father had hired did everything they could to make the disease recede. Every day she grew stronger and more alert. She was now living with us, surrounded by care and love, and I could feel the warmth of our family returning to her as she fought her illness. Our lives had taken on a new meaning. We were no longer the same people we had been before. We became a true family, able to overcome any challenge, knowing that together we could do anything. I realized that the ordeal I went through was not only a lesson for me. It changed my father too, teaching him to value not only success and money, but also human connection, love, and care. We became closer than ever, and I knew we had a bright future ahead of us. One night, as Maria and I sat in the kitchen of our new home, she suddenly asked me a question that made me think deeply. What would have happened if you hadn't crashed that car back then? She asked quietly, looking at me with her serious but still kind eyes. I was silent for a long time, staring into my cup of cool tea, pondering her question. It wasn't just a question about the car. It was a question about how one mistake can change a life, how one event can completely change the course of fate. I guess I would have stayed the same person I was, I finally answered, choosing my words slowly. I would have lived as I had before, carefree, not thinking about what was going on around me, thinking only of myself and my own desires. I might never have learned what true love is, what it means to care about someone other than myself. And I never would have met you. Maria smiled, squeezed my hand so tightly that I felt the warmth of her palm. There was something special about her smile, something that gave me confidence and reminded me of how much we'd been through together. Who would have thought that a regular old Ford could change the lives of three people, me, you, and my mom? She said with a quiet laugh, as if she was trying to lighten our memories. I nodded, feeling a lump come up in my throat, and it was hard to speak. Really, who would have thought that one accident, one rash decision, could lead to such a global change in life? Now, looking back, I realized that the day I crashed my father's car was not the end, as it seemed to me at the time, but, on the contrary, the beginning. The beginning of a new life. The beginning of a new me. A man who understands what is most important in life. If it hadn't been for that mistake, I don't know how my fate would have turned out. Maybe I would have never really grown up. would have remained that spoiled little boy who thought the world revolved around him, I added, not so much talking to Maria as thinking out loud. Maria listened to me silently, her eyes full of understanding. She always knew how to listen, always knew when to speak and when to be silent. This is one of the traits I especially appreciate in her. Now I know the value of every dollar I earn, every smile of my loved ones, every moment we spend together, I continued, more confidently. Life has taught me that true values lie far beyond money and comfort. They are to be found in the people you love, in family, in caring, in the willingness to give your last for another person. My father often says he's proud of me, but I know that without his harsh lesson, without the way he left me to myself, and without Maria and her mom, I would never have become the person I am now. I wouldn't have learned what it means to truly fight for my family, what it means to go through hardship in order to preserve what is most precious. Sometimes when I walk past the garage, I see the new Ford my dad bought to replace the old one I wrecked. He says it's a reminder of how one car changed our whole family's life. To him, it's probably a symbol of his educational methods and how he helped me change. But for me, this new car has become a symbol of something else, a symbol that true wealth is not measured in material things, whether cars or money. It is measured by love, caring, and what we are willing to sacrifice for those we care about. If I were offered the opportunity to go back and change the day I wrecked my father's car, I would not accept. Despite all the pain I went through, despite the humiliation and hardship, it all led me to where I am now. To real happiness, to a real family. And looking back, I realized that every hardship, every challenge was necessary for me to become the person I am today. Who knows, maybe one day I'll tell this story to my children. The story of how one old Ford changed not only my life, but the lives of 3 people in our family. And, hopefully, my children will realize the main lesson I learned from this story. Sometimes, to gain something truly valuable, you have to lose everything else. I want to apologize for any mistakes in the text or dubbing. I am just learning, and the language of this channel is not my mother tongue. The dubbing is done with the help of artificial intelligence. Please point out errors so I can fix them and improve the quality of the content. Also, I will be glad if you share your thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments is very motivating for me to keep looking for new, interesting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Subscribe to the channel and put a bell to not miss new stories.